Alrighty, hello everyone. So, as we wait for people to trickle in, as you can see, we are still continuing with our Pong game. And in this week's lesson, what's going to happen is we're going to start moving all of our code into classes. And when we move our code into classes, there's a couple key points that we have to look out for. So I'm going to go ahead and show you what we need to make sure we don't miss when we go ahead and we do this switching over process, right? So I'm going to go ahead, show our code here. Alright, so first of all, we're not going to be editing the same file. We are going to be creating a new file, and this one will be called, say, Pong class. And Pong class, obviously, is going to have some classes as shown by the name. Now, one important thing to understand is that, well, what exactly are we going to do here, right? There's a couple different things that we have to pay attention to when we're doing this kind of switchover step. The main thing is, well, what kind of classes are we going to actually create? In this game, there are two things that we could possibly make a class out of. So I'll give you about 30 seconds to think about that, and then I will go over what it is, obviously. Alright, so the two objects are going to be the paddle and the ball, right? The paddle and the ball, very self-explanatory. Yes, good job, Dragon PK. That's exactly what it is. So, do you know what we do when we come up with our new classes? All we have to do is just write class paddle and class ball. And that's all we have to do to start off our code. Now, the general course of the code, the actual contents for each class, is going to, of course, be determined by our previous program over here. So there are a lot of variables that are global, which essentially means that they'll be accessed everywhere. And we're not going to be touching these, so we will just go ahead and copy this and paste it right here. That's simple. Now, there are a couple of important things to mention when we go ahead and we create a class. So in case you don't remember, in our short class over the class and objects, we know that we have to go ahead and define our init function. That is essential in defining all the class variables. So over here, we will go ahead and define the init functions ourselves. It might be two ends. How many is it? Alright, it's only one end. So PyCharm will let you know that you typed it incorrectly with the purple identification, and whatever parameters you want to put in here is what is going to have to be defined inside the init or initialize function. So the next step is, of course, we're only going to be dealing with our paddle class at the moment, is to actually look through our code here, right? So in our code, we obviously have our ball initiation. This initializes some of the ball functions. And then we have our main initialize function. Goes up to here. Inside this main initialize function, there are a couple of variables that we do have to pay attention to. So first of all, we have to understand, alright, the paddle has to start somewhere. So when we go ahead and we program in the location of the paddle, we're going to have to know two important things. On a coordinate plane, there's an x and a y. X and y can be a little confusing to deal with, so we are just going to refer to them as width and height. Those are going to be our first two variables. Our next ones are going to be, we have to pay attention to this, right? So obviously we are going to have our velocities. At what rate is our paddle going, right? And we'll just define this as paddle velocity. And you'll notice, oh, paddle position is actually defined as a variable here, and we have it defined as two different things. Well, there is something special known as a class variable, and that is before I go ahead and I write this init function, I can go ahead and type paddle position is equal to 0, 0. So before anything has been passed through, we've already defined our paddle position. Now, we're just going to go ahead and give it a blank list. We don't want to assign anything quite yet. But as we go ahead and we move forward, it's important to note that there are different scopes of the variables. These variables can be accessed anywhere inside this entire program. These variables are going to be ones that you can only access inside the class. And eventually, we're going to have variables inside each method, which can only be accessed within each method. At the moment, you will notice that there are some variables that we will not need that are global variables. And we're not going to delete them, we're just going to comment them out. And by commenting them out, essentially what we're doing is we're saying, all right, we know we have this code here, but we don't quite need it. So, all of these we do not need at the moment, right? Actually, we do need this one. We do need our half pad. So, now we go over here, and in our init function with our current variables, obviously it's not quite finished yet, but with our current variables, we want to go ahead and define them. So we go back to our file here, and we know we define it as self.size is equal to size, right? So self.width would be equal, self.width is equal to width. Self.height is equal to height. Self.paddle velocity is equal to paddle velocity. Now that we've done this, we want to go back to our code here, and we look at this and we notice, all right, there's something going on here. First of all, we understand that our paddle 1 position is defined as half pad width minus 1, comma, height divided by 2. So we want to know exactly where these variables are defined and exactly what they mean, because at the moment we don't necessarily know what exactly they're referring to. Well, our width and height are both referring to the size of our board, and our pad width and pad height are referring to the size of the paddles. So when we go ahead and we initialize our width and height here, we actually don't need to care about that, because when we go ahead and we call it, that is when we will worry about the actual numbers. At the moment, all we need to go ahead and do is just define our paddle position, self.paddle position equal to width, comma, height. That is what's important, because we do know that now that we have our width and height, we do want to define it as our paddle position, because it is what is going to be used in the rest of our program, and we want to try and keep it as consistent as possible. So now we go ahead, we look through here, we notice, all right, is our scoreboard something that we need to go ahead and create a class for? Well, the answer is no. And the reason why is because you're only going to really have 2 scores, maximum 4, right? But, having more than 2 scoreboards is kind of clunky, and there's no reason to do it. So there is no reason to go ahead and create a class for something that we know we're never going to expand on. For our paddles, we know that we could, if we were to have, say, 2 people in each team, 3 people in each team. Our balls, we could add 2 balls, 3 balls, right? So there's all these different factors that we do have to count in. Now, we go over here and we notice, all right, after it goes ahead and it calls ball init, then it will go ahead and call ball init. And in ball init, it will go ahead and determine, all right, it defines all these variables, and then we go back to our main being at the bottom in our game loop, right? And we notice, all right, now it goes into draw. So we go to our function draw, and this is where the action begins. So our draw function at the moment seemingly does not have any anything to do with our paddle. However, we have to look a little more closely. So it makes the board here, and then we see, oh, okay, so it's actually calling paddle movement here, which is a function, and that means that we do have to worry about how it's going to be affecting our paddle. Well, our draw function in itself is actually not going to be inside here, and instead what we're going to go ahead and do is copy this entire function, and I want you guys to look over this function and see what exactly are we going to be doing with this. So I'll give you a couple I'll give you a minute to look over it, and then I will go ahead and explain exactly how we're going to go ahead and split this up. Alright, so this was a little bit of a harder question, as there are a lot of things that need to be done here. First of all, we have to notice a couple of things. There's a lot of red underlines here. What do these red underlines mean? Well, what they mean is essentially all of these, functions, variables here, they're referring to something. And in our program, we don't have that anywhere. And, of course, that's a problem. Well, of course, for the program. We know what's going on, but the program's like, hey, you're referencing something that's not here. So what needs to happen is we need to understand ourselves, what exactly do we mean in some of these? Well, we look through this, and we can see that the first thing it does is it initializes a bunch of global variables. Well, we know we don't need our paddle 1 and 2 positions. We don't need our ball position. We don't need our ball velocity. Instead, the only two that we do need to initialize are left score and right score. The next thing is we realize, alright, well, we can see inside our draw canvas, the first 6 lines are actually all that needs to be within our draw function here. Everything else here can be put outside of our draw function, except for this, drawing scoreboard. So we will delete all this code here. Actually, we'll just comment it out for now, knowing that we did in fact just skip over it, and understanding that this is code that we will come back to. Now, draw scoreboard. We obviously don't have that function. So what we're going to go ahead and do is we're just going to copy this, and we're just going to paste it here, into here. So now everything is referred to, and we see that we don't have any red underlines here. Well, this is a blank class, so Python is a little angry at that, so we will comment that out. And there we go. We don't have any more red underlines complaining about how we don't have the proper functions needed that we called. Now, we need to take a look at this. First of all, we need to understand, alright, it calls 2 functions related to our paddle movement and drawing paddle. both of those functions we are going to need inside our class of a paddle. So we're just going to define them right here. We want paddle movement, and we want draw paddle. Well, we do notice one more thing. It needs a canvas. It needs something to draw on. So canvas is something that we will need to put in our initialization. So we're going to define canvas, and we're also going to say self.canvas is equal to canvas. It's important to make sure that you do actually define all of these as class variables. Otherwise, Python will be very, very confused as to what in the world you're referring to. Now, we've made this progress so far, and it's a little confusing. We're still at a very abstract step. Well, obviously, we do want the bulk of the code inside the actual functions. So we're just going to copy and paste the code into here for now. We should probably actually copy the name as well, because we do need the parameter. That is paddle.movement, and this is draw paddle. So take a moment to look at these two methods here and tell me if you notice, or actually note to yourself if you see anything that's a bit odd with the way that PyCharm has formatted these functions. So I'll give you about 30 seconds to look at this and make your conclusion. Alright, well, the weird thing about this is that all this text is green. The thing is that the first mistake that we did is we didn't refer to it as self. So every single one of these variables has to have a self dot in front of it, unless it's a global variable that was defined over here, not inside this function. If you'll notice, you will see self.paddle position and paddle position. When we go ahead and we call it as just paddle position, the program will not give us an error here. But if we are to actually run the program, it will go, what are you referring to? And of course, it will get very confused. And when we go ahead and we copy over the parameters like this, it's just an unneeded overlap. You actually only need self. So what we're going to go ahead and do is just refer to everything here as self dot whatever variable we want. So this is a lot of renaming, so this will take a second to complete. Actually, I just go ahead and copy this. There we go. Now that we've done this, we need to do the exact same thing with this. And we need to do every single variable. And we will notice one thing at the very end. Self.color is not defined inside our initialization function. But how come it's not red? Well, the reason is because the only reason why PyCharm will highlight something as red is when that variable is nowhere to be found. However, self is built into this class, so it will not strike it as off, right? We do, in fact, need our color to be defined, and we will just define that as self.color is equal to color. Just like that. So, at this stage, we're starting to get our grips on this. We have our paddles defined, and things seem to be going smoothly. So at this point, we need to realize, all right, we did comment all of this out, but how do we get this back into the game? You know, how do we make sure we know exactly what is happening? Well, that all comes inside our game main loop. In our main loop in our original program that was found at the very, very bottom, and we notice it's this very short, maybe 10, 15, 20 lines of code that just calls our methods that are needed. In this case, what our main method or our main loop is going to look like is almost essentially like this, except it's going to be creating objects for us. And from the objects, we can go ahead and call its methods. So, first thing that we want to do is obviously we want to copy this, and we want to see, all right, there's obviously going to be a couple methods that aren't here. Key down and key up are actually both methods that are a little hard to identify where they should go at first. So first off, we have our draw canvas here. So draw canvas will go ahead and perform just the drawing portion right over here. But you'll also notice that it has to do these functions. So instead of putting them inside the draw, we will just put them right over here. When we go ahead and we do this, so what we'll do is we'll define this, or rather we need to create our objects now. So when we create our objects, they actually do need to be outside of the loop. We don't want to be creating a new object every single time we loop through that. So we want to look at that. All right, our class name is called paddle, so we will name our first paddle paddle1, and it's going to be called paddle, and we do have to list something for every single one of these parameters. So for now, we're just going to be putting a for every single one of them. So there's 5 here, so we need to do 5 A's. But they would need to be strings, so we'll just change them all to ones. There we go. So we don't have our error, and you'll notice, all right, so PyCharm is very helpful in that if you go ahead and you hover over the class name, it will give you every single one of the variables you have to account for. We have to do width, height, paddle velocity, canvas, and color. And you'll also notice that it says any after every single one of these. Well, what this any means is it's referring to the typing. In this case, it can be any type because we never did anything with it. And if we were to actually do some, say, mathematical calculation with some of them, then they would be referred to as, say, integer or double or something like that. So that's essentially one of the perks of using PyCharm as your IDE. So now that we've done this, we notice, all right, well, we do have this initialization function that we do need to account for. So that is something that we will have to come back to. We go ahead and we look at that and we see, all right, there's a couple of things that we do need to pay attention to. However, it does include our ball initialization, so we will have to back off from it for now. So obviously the perk of having a class is we can create multiple classes. We can make this paddle 2, we can make a paddle 3, but for now we'll stick with 2. Just to prove that the concept of a class does indeed work. So once we've created this paddle, well, how do we actually get these methods to work? Well, all we have to do is just call paddle.paddle movement. And everything inside here is already defined for us because it is just self, right? Easy as that. However, is it really that easy? And did we in fact do this step right or not? Well, we go back to our draw function. And we notice, all right, everything seems normal here. It's just defining our paddle movement. And once it goes ahead and defines this paddle movement, it's assigning everything. Whoa. Now, this is a big step up. The reason why is because paddle movement is no longer actually just some random variable that's within this class. It's actually something that's supposed to be changing. Meaning that by assigning everything as self dot here is actually a mistake. So this is something that we will actually probably just go over next class, as it is a very big concept to understand. and taking that step forward can be a little confusing at first. So for now, we won't really talk about that. So we'll just go ahead and delete this function call for now, and we will move on to our class of ball. So our class of ball does have some things that we need to consider, obviously. So we have our ball init function right over here. And ball init function has a couple of different things that we do need to initialize. We have position and velocity. So when we go ahead and do that, we'll copy this portion over here. And we do need our semicolon or colon. So we want ball position, we want ball velocity, and now we want to go ahead and define them as self dot ball position is equal to ball position, self dot ball velocity is equal to ball velocity. Just like that. We go ahead, we look through this, we notice, alright, there's this horizontal and vertical. Well, these aren't actual variables that were passed through, they're just using the random function. That's fine, we can ignore that for now. We notice, alright, so ball velocity is defined as horizontal, comma, minus vert. So now we know, alright, this is not something that we can just call inside our function here. Instead, we will need to go ahead and actually put into the main loop ourselves. So now that we've done that, we do want to look at all of our ball functions. We go through here, and we see draw scoreboard, draw paddle, paddle movement, ball movement. We do need this. So we'll go ahead, stick this all inside ball movement. And we will see, oh, there are a lot of reds here. A lot of reds. So we will need to go ahead and replace all of these as self in a moment. So I will let you kind of formulate your own idea as to how we can go ahead and oh, I just realized something. We don't have self here. Otherwise, it would not be red. So I will let you guys take this moment to formulate an idea of how we can go ahead and move forward in this, and take a look and see, is everything in this method actually needed? Alright, so you will notice one thing. It calls a paddle here. And this is where it gets a little bit confusing for us. Because, well, this is inside the ball function, you know? It's no longer just outside in the main loop. And this is all the logic part. This is the fun part of programming, because you will have to go ahead and figure this out for yourselves. So for now, we will just put a comment here, and we will call this alert calls paddle. And we won't touch that for now, because it's quite complicated as to how you will go ahead and fix this. Next thing is we're just going to keep on going through our methods and make sure we bring every single one. In here, all of these are not going to actually need to be inside any of our functions. They can be outside. But we will notice that they also call the paddle. Uh-oh, this gets a little confusing now. So in every single one of these, it calls a paddle here. But there is something special in Python. What you can do is you can actually just stick a paddle inside the parameter. So all these objects that you created, they're essentially just special variables in the end. That's what they are. They're variables that you created for your own specific purpose, but they're still variables. Meaning that they can be put in parameters, they can be changed just like any other variable, they can be reassigned just like any other variable. Anything that you can do with a regular, say, string, you can do with our objects. Unless, of course, it's an exclusive function that you can only call if it's a string, right? With that knowledge, that's a lot of stuff that we do have to go ahead and change and understand for ourselves. For now, I will go ahead and upload our code at the moment into GitHub, and I will post the link to the code in chat. And from here, I can go ahead and end off this lesson. I don't have anything else I want to say, but this class, this movement towards creating a class is going to take a little bit of time, most likely 2 to 3 classes, and it's going to be something that will rely a lot on trying to really understand these concepts, everything behind it. So hopefully you guys can stick with me, and without further ado, I guess, thank you for watching. So if you have any questions, feel free to go ahead and ask them right now. If you don't have any questions, then thank you for watching, and I will see you guys next class. That the link that I just posted in the chat is going to be the one that you will use in order to access the code that we created today. It is not a working piece of code, but it is something that you can look at and try to understand for yourself, and definitely try to make changes. Again, there are a lot of changes that do need to be made to this function or this file here, so feel free to make premature changes yourself, and we can go over the changes that I will make to better this next class. It looks like no one has any questions, so thank you for watching, and I will see you guys next week. Thank you.